I'm imagining you, dear listener, pressing play on Underdog Leadership, a primer, when you sit down to grab a cup of tea in a quiet moment, or maybe you're washing the dishes, or maybe you're driving from A to B. And I'm delighted to have you here today. So, what the heck is Underdog Leadership? What does Jenny Mitchell have to say about it? And why do we need an entire podcast session about it? Let me tell you more. So, I am very interested in the journey from becoming a number two to becoming a number one. Let me back that up and unpack that for you. I believe fundamentally, and I am particularly interested in people who have overcome hardships. And I'm not here to judge the kind of hardship you've had, whether it was personal trauma on an extreme level, whether it was leaving an abusive relationship, whether it was being passed over for a promotion, whether it was always feeling like you were stifled. I'm interested in the experience you've had, but what I'm even more interested in is how did you overcome it and what's possible now that you're on the other side of that experience. And in my work as an executive coach, in my work predominantly with women, I find that there are a lot of behaviors that we have as number twos. We identify with the concept of the underdog. Our job is to support the number ones, make everybody else look good. And those skills, those attributes are actually a detriment to our ability to lead with confidence. And so I feel like there's an opportunity to take a microcosm look at that number two to number one. What behaviors do I want to enhance? How can I step into my place of power and still own the terminology of underdog? So the term underdog, let's just unpack that for a second. First of all, are we not all rooting for an underdog? However, maybe you don't identify with that term. There's a wonderful book by Malcolm Gladwell, if you haven't read it, called David and Goliath, that sort of demystifies the concept of the underdog and uses the archetypal story of David and Goliath, where the assumption that Goliath, the bigger one, the bigger, more strong, powerful person, is automatically going to win the fight, right? Versus David, who's just a shepherd boy, and etc. And what Malcolm Gladwell does in that story is explain all the other things that we don't see in that scenario, and how an underdog has some special skills, and most importantly, that the underdog can't fight Goliath in the way that Goliath is expecting him to fight. And so that creativity, look at that creativity, that new way of looking at something, that's what I find really interesting. The second story that's coming up, and I'm going to botch the history of it, and my husband's going to laugh at me when I tell this story, or if he listens to this, is the story of World War II with the U-boats, how the British made a call out to all the fishing boats, right, in the neighborhood to fight in the war. And these big, massive submarines and tanks and ships were attacking. And the agility of the fishermen boats were able to get in between all these boats, and the tanks and the big stuff wasn't able to move quickly enough, and they ended up winning the war. And it was sort of that underdog experience once again, right? Certainly England was an underdog in World War II along the way. So put your historical edits and changes to the podcast and correct me in the show notes, if you will, or in the comment section. But I'm really interested in that because I think for so long, our paradigm of leadership has been about the big guys. We think of the corporate world. We think of the presidents in the United States. We don't have a lot of, from my perspective, a lot of women to look at to role model this new style of leadership, right? Perhaps Obama was a good example of not so much an underdog, but somebody or a face or something that's represented that we haven't seen a lot of. And when we haven't seen a lot of it, there's a vulnerability that goes with it. So my dad always said to me that, he would say to me, Jenny, if it was easy, you wouldn't be interested in doing it. And so that's kind of explained a lot of my journey and this idea of hooking on to underdog leadership is I'm like, where's the challenge? Where's the opportunity? How can I unpack this story for the benefit of all of my listeners, all of my coaching clients, trying to kind of normalize this and discuss it out in the open so it doesn't hold power over us. As women, we don't have a lot of role models. I think of Angela Merkel. In Germany, I think of Hillary Clinton. Those are women that are significantly older than me and get pigeonholed a lot. And I want to bring forward a new title, a new style of leadership that I'm calling Underdog Leadership, because the people who have overcome something, stereotyping, gender discrimination, all of those things, being forced out of something, struggled because of values that were misaligned, those are perfectly the people that we need right now in our leadership positions to solve the next 50 and 100 years of challenges on our planet. Because the old models are broken, we're struggling to move forward to find new models and new structures and new paradigms. And these people that have felt excluded in some way, that's another part of the underdog paradigm, are the people we want to hear more of. This podcast is an homage to them. This podcast is to say your work matters. Don't give up. We need your voice at the table, right? I've shared in another one of my podcasts, my why, which was to lean into meaningful conversations with others so that they are empowered to use their seat at the table. That's what all my work is about. And so taking that microcosm of underdog leadership is absolutely fascinating. So let's take a minute to talk about exclusion and inclusion. That dialogue is now happening at the global level under the terminology equity, diversity, and inclusion. I am by far not an expert in that subject, and of course I would always defer to others, but I do kind of find it kind of funny that now that it's named, we have these strategies and these systems and these processes, because isn't it just good sense that we have a variety of people around the table? Isn't it good sense that we make and take the time to hear from everybody? It's kind of ironic to me. Anyone listening to this podcast who remembers being on a playground when you were in elementary school and being excluded from something, you know what that pain feels like, right? It is visceral. It is, I am not good enough. Nobody likes me. On a primal level, it means, where will I get my next meal from, right? Because we are social beings. I love the expression, we are spiritual beings living a human existence, not human beings living a spiritual existence, right? We are spiritual and connected first. I don't care where you land on the spiritual woo-woo spectrum. You're going to hear more of that from me over the years, because I think when we tap into these stories, these narratives, and that feeling of being excluded is so powerful, people. It defines us. It drives our stories, whether we make them conscious or subconscious. And so as a grown-up, one thing I notice about my behavior as an underdog leader is I am driven to include all the voices at the table. I am driven to seek feedback. I am driven, compelled even, to listen with big, huge, massive ears. That does not mean that I do or that I consult to death, right? Or that I collaborate to death. But I am hardwired to take in the landscape around me. That, I think, is one of the criteria for an underdog leader. Remember, I was talking about number twos becoming number ones. There's a couple of behaviors that number twos have specifically that I think inhibit them from moving into number one and owning that conversation space. One of them is, I think, as a number two, as a person in a supporting role, we shun the limelight big time. It's not about us, it's about our mission. It's not about us, it's about what a great job the board did. It's not about us, it's about how our leader led us through this X, Y, and Z. And that dismissal of our contribution into that effort is something we have to talk about and we have to change. We don't like being the center of attention. I can't tell you how difficult it is to me, even now, even all the work I've done, so much work, and whatever work you're doing, whether it's personal therapy, whether it's breath work, whether it's working with a coach, I really believe if you're in the pursuit of excellence, in the pursuit of the betterment of yourself, in the pursuit of the best next 50 years on your planet, find yourself someone who will hold you accountable. And, we shy away from being the center of attention. We avoid things. The other behavior I think we find as number twos that we have to overcome is we want to be the people pleaser. We want to be liked. There, I said it out loud. And so I even find myself now trying to find solutions that are inclusive, perhaps at the detriment of clarity. I'm going to say it again. Solutions that are inclusive, but perhaps at the detriment of clarity. When underdog leadership leaders speak, at the end of the meeting, people, regardless of how we behave, what we talk about, how we include others, there must be clarity on the next steps. We can't collaborate ourselves down out of a problem. We have to collaborate ourselves up out of a problem. I'm struck by Patrick Lencioni's 5 Dysfunctions of a Team. If you've ever read that book, it's fantastic. And there are sort of 5 layers to teamwork. The first one is trust. You have to trust each other. The second one is conflict. You have to be able to trust each other so much that you're going to go into conflict and you're going to fight like mad and you're going to disagree with each other. And if you've ever held space for those kinds of conversations, at least for me, who's conflict averse, those can be very triggering, right? So getting clear and owning our own space in those conflict conversations. But that next layer up is the really cool one, which is consensus. So all this shit hits the fan. We have the big fight. We decide on the strategy, or we disagree on the strategy. But when we get to consensus, it is a place where either the group has clarity on the consensus and we make a decision, or the underdog leader steps in and says, based on this conversation, this is the way forward, providing the clarity that our teams need to move forward. And because of that consensus or clarity, then we get action, because the action is aligned with the decision we've taken. And once we've all agreed on it, we can no longer go back to, well, see, I told you that wouldn't work, right? Because we are all complicit in the decision making. And finally, once we have action, we can stand by those elevated results that we're having. That is Patrick Lencioni's 5 Dysfunctions of a Team. Highly recommend that book. And there's so many ways that we can think about those processes. Is it always perfect in our workplaces? No, it's not. But I think as I define underdog leadership, it's about stepping into your confidence and your place of what you do know. We're never going to know it all, to provide clarity to the teams around you. And just a quick aside on that want to be liked. I wonder if this is just a female thing. I'm not sure. I'd love to hear from some men. I know some men in my life that truly want to be liked just as much. And it can be a real Achilles heel, right? Because you can start to define your worth by your likability. And if you've listened to some of my other podcasts, I've started the idea of external hurdles and internal hurdles. And the wanting to be liked is one of those external hurdles. You can't control it. It's not you. You can't control that hurdle. Like, can you convince someone to like you? No. What you can do is show up and like yourself, like your choices, like the team you've put together, like the values that you've identified for yourself. That sort of steps us into this whole idea of self-love, which I also think is part of the underdog leader journey, is coming from a place of I'm not good enough to maybe I'm okay to, my style has merit, to perhaps I have something to contribute, and that my voice, stepping into the limelight, becoming more visible, as my colleague Sylvia talks about in our Your Next 50 podcast, is part of that journey. quick aside, how many of you have that heart palpitation the minute before you press post on LinkedIn, the minute before you step onto stage, the minute before you start an important speech or an important meeting? We've been told, or I was told, that when I arrive, that would go away. Well, folks, I'm here to tell you it hasn't gone away yet, and I'm 50 years old, and there's not a ton of time left, so I am letting go of that right here, right now. Underdog leadership is about, despite all those feelings, despite all that discomfort, you still choose to go forward and step into it. That's, to me, what true courage is and how an underdog leader leads. So let's just take a look, compare underdog leadership to other styles of leadership, just in a little kind of microcosm. I think we're familiar with, let's call it top-down leadership. I had the word macho leadership here, but maybe that's not quite the right word. Top-down, I'm the boss, you do what I say. And I think we've now been able to define that as power over. Brene Brown has done a ton of research on that. Power over is about leading from fear, right? If you don't do what I say, you will be fired. You will be in lack. Something bad will happen to you. Power over is a history that dates back, and a story that dates back hundreds of years. We are unpacking and uncovering all of that through our work on reconciliation in Canada, through the Indigenous communities, and I think on a lot of other levels with women, with identified minorities, and there's tons of work to be done. That the preferred version that I see more of is power with or power to. That the underdog leader leads, but provides power to others, to elevate them, to bring them the autonomy they desire to make the best decisions moving forward. Sometimes we hear about servant leadership, and I struggle with this one. I don't like the term, and the reason I think I don't like the term is it's the idea, again, that there's a hierarchy, that we serve others. And I know for many people, this is a fundamental, that leadership is serving others. I'm not saying I disagree with that, but servant leadership implies to me a disproportionate piece in the relationship. And I'm very interested in equality and equity. And so that underdog leadership for me is about overcoming something, owning your own stories, your own narratives, and everybody being on the equal playing field and making the best decisions collaboratively together and having clarity. And so I almost feel like servant leadership is it's like a reverse selfish thing. I don't know. I'm curious to see people's comments afterwards. That's a personal decision. I think the principles of it are important. And again, I think we're walking in a new space where we're trying to define this new style of leadership. I remember I always love to tell stories as examples. Being in here we go with the awards, right? The awards and the decision making about who is the best XYZ woman of the year, whatever the title of the award is. And being around a table with different ages of women in this case. So all archetypically would be defined as underdogs by our socioeconomic definitions, simplifying here, people. And the way that the older women who had been through the ranks fighting the patriarchy or the establishment brought their discussions forward versus the way the young people who were brought up in a much more collaborative, think about all the teamwork that we did in that they have done in high school, and the value placed on collaboration when coming up with solutions, just the way their brains work and the way they've been trained, the way they brought up discussions or conversation points. And so I'm paraphrasing, but the older women, the women who'd had to claw their way or fight their way or perhaps conform to a way of power over, would come up with things like, well, it's obvious, it's XYZ because of this, this, and this, right? And put a lot more merit on credentials, a lot more merit on accomplishments, right? A very microcosm case in point was the way these women on paper talked about their families. And within the group of decision makers, there was a visceral reaction to whether you should or should not include stories about your family in your application for a Businesswoman of the Year award. So interesting, right? So for me, as an underdog leader, my family is part of my story. It's my raison d'etre. It's part of my overcoming. It's an integral. If you want to understand me, you have to understand the whole Jenny Mitchell. And yet there were people around the table that thought that was a total no-no. Men wouldn't do that. So why would we do that, right? So can you see these paradigms? And then the younger people were so much more thoughtful and listening ears to what was going on, almost like they were sifting the ideas. I'm simplifying here, but it's a trend I definitely do see. And I wonder if at this point, we have to give some compassion, some love, some understanding to those women who broke the ranks, who carved the way forward for us. I have friends, older friends, who've told me stories about meetings that were held at conferences where she was one of 5 senior leaders in the government of men. So she was the one woman, and the men decided to host a meeting in one of their hotel rooms. And they didn't tell her. She called up to the room and asked them where they were. And they said, oh, we're having the meeting up here. And when she arrived, can you imagine this? When she arrived, the only seat available to her was on the bed, sitting on the bed. 1 woman, 5 men, hotel room, making decisions about business. And the snickering and the humor, it just makes me sick. Can you see how I have great compassion for that thick armor that was required to function in that world, to be heard in that world? I'm sending out all the love to that generation of women. Do we need the armor anymore? Can we find a different way? Is underdog leadership part of that journey, part of that process? If I was to embrace that title, dear listener, how would that change? Brene Brown talks about strong back, soft front, wild heart. Oh my gosh, right? That wild heart to me is the creativity. We've lost so much as women with losing that feminine side of us because it was not available or acceptable to us at the boardroom table or in the decision making. And so women created these subcultures, right, of all women. And we're famous for our pecking orders as women and our sort of snarkiness. That's something I cannot abide. That's where I think underdog leadership has a great leg up, that we can really speak differently, that no one is ostracized, no one is excluded. We find places for people where they can contribute. And that's what an inspired underdog leader does. Wow. I'm feeling like that is a moment. That is a clarity moment for me. Dear listeners, is it clear to you now what underdog leadership is and how you might choose to embrace it? In coming episodes, I'd love to talk more about those behaviors, those sort of ingrained, built-in behaviors that hold us back. But I think the takeaway today is if there's an intuition, if there's an inkling for you that you have this desire to have more impact, you have to have more presence. To have more presence, you need to seek out the limelight. To have more limelight, you need to speak up and use your voice and your tools and your network and your community. And how can that be a bad thing? So notice those whispers, notice those little voices saying, who are you to do X, Y, and Z? And say to those voices, thank you so much, but I'm going to do it anyway. I'm going to step into that new leadership paradigm. I'm going to invite in dialogue and conversation at an elevated level for the benefit of all. So that's my other hook is it's not about you, right? Which is where I can identify with servant leadership. It's not about you. It's about being a beacon. It's about being a light. It's about bringing all of yourself to those conversations. Remember I said this podcast will be about meaningful conversations. I'm not interested in the fluff. I'm not interested in the ostracizing and the separating out. I'm interested in the messy middle. I'm interested in the big conversations. I'm interested in duking it out here with you on the podcast about the things that I'm struggling with or the things that you're struggling with, so that as underdogs, we can overcome these things or gain some clarity for the benefit of all. Dear listeners, this is where I leave you. If I have piqued your interest, if you're ready to double down on your own personal style or brand of leadership, if you've been inspired by my journey, my photos, which have been coming out lately from my recent photo shoot, by some of my podcasts, please do get in touch. It would be my honor to support you on your leadership journey, wherever that is, in whatever sector that is, and wherever you are motivated to go. I think I thrive best with women having a bigger vision for themselves. Many of you are in the corporate world, either moving up the ranks or moving across the ranks, or in that case, wanting to be better underdog leaders for those below you. I also know that money and power can be kind of loaded words for women. I am on a mission to reposition those, reimagine those for the good of all of us. And I also think that I really identify with the women that are in their quote unquote prime, the women that are saying, if not now, when? Those whispers need to be tended to. You know what the next step is. I invite you to act on it. Have a great day. Thanks for listening.